They were not looking for anything extraordinary when they rode into the valley. Their orders mentioned elevations, not legends, fault lines, not spirits. On paper, the 1893 survey of the Sangre de Cristo Range was another small task in the vast project of measuring the American West. Yet before the expedition ever unpacked its instruments, one quiet detail had already marked this valley as different. The Ute guides, who had led white surveyors everywhere from winter passes to sacred hunting grounds, stopped at the ridgeline and refused to go any farther. The official record reduces that moment to a single line. In his field notebook, surveyor Nathaniel Crawford wrote, "Local guides unwilling to enter basin cite old stories and decline further service." There is no argument recorded, no attempt at persuasion. The words stand alone, followed by a change of ink color and a new heading. Proceeding with party only. From that point on, the map of the valley would be drawn entirely by men who arrived with no memory of what it had meant to others. Crawford was a meticulous professional, the kind of surveyor territorial governors valued. He had served on 3 prior expeditions, each one bringing new parcels of land into the rational grid of American property law. He trusted instruments, not impressions. In his kit, wrapped carefully against the cold, were a brass theodolite, folding rods, a set of chain measures, and sheets of pre-ruled graph paper ready to receive lines and numbers. If something could be seen, it could be measured. If it could be measured, it could be placed on a map. That was the unspoken assumption underpinning his work. The valley below the ridge looked at first glance like many others in the high Rockies. A bowl of land carved by glaciers, ringed by serrated peaks, its floor stitched with pine forest and pale ribbons of snowmelt. From a distance, there was nothing to suggest that previous visitors had treated it differently from any other sheltered basin. The Ute name for the area, which Crawford noted phonetically in his journal, translated roughly as place where the earth speaks. He wrote it down, underlined it once, and drew a small circle on his preliminary sketch. Then he began the descent. The first day's work followed the standard pattern. The party established a base camp near a spring, drove stakes, and took initial readings to fix their position relative to known peaks. Crawford recorded barometric pressure, temperature, and compass bearings. His assistant, a younger man named Wilkes, copied the data into a second log for redundancy. The routine of measurements and calculations imposed a familiar rhythm on unfamiliar ground. In the evening, as they sat around a small, carefully shielded fire, Wilkes mentioned the guide's refusal to enter the valley. "Do you think they know something we don't?" he asked. Crawford, who disliked speculation in any form, answered without looking up from his notebook. "They know stories," he said. "We know elevations. That will suffice." It was not that Crawford dismissed indigenous knowledge entirely. His previous reports cited Ute and Navajo place names, and he had occasionally used their path networks when planning routes. But to him these were aids to navigation, not sources of truth about the land itself. The job of a surveyor was to replace narrative with measurement, to turn rough descriptions into coordinates. Stories belonged in the margins, if they belonged at all. The first indication that this valley might resist such neat conversion came on the second morning. Crawford chose a narrow ravine on the eastern side as his starting line for detailed measurements. It offered a clear line of sight from the valley floor to a prominent ridge, ideal for triangulation. As he and Wilkes advanced, They began to notice markings on the rock faces. At first a few straight cuts, then more elaborate shapes. They were not random scratches. On 3 separate boulders, the same design appeared, a ring of intersecting lines forming a star-like pattern, each segment precisely mirrored. Crawford stopped long enough to make a quick pencil sketch in his notebook. Underneath he wrote, "Unusual carvings, likely indigenous." Then he added a small note in smaller script. "Level of symmetry suggests intentional geometrical design." It was an observation, not yet a conclusion. The schedule pressed them onward. Further up the ravine, the markings multiplied. Some appeared fresh, others weathered almost smooth. The designs grew more complex. Spirals intersecting with straight lines, sequences of triangles that formed patterns when viewed from a certain angle. Wilkes, who had some training in engineering drawing, commented that the proportions seemed too regular to be casual decoration. "What do you think they mean?" he asked. Crawford closed his notebook. "They mean people were here before us," he replied. "That much is obvious. The rest is conjecture, and conjecture does not belong in a survey." Yet something about the markings stayed with him. That evening, after completing his calculations, he returned alone to the ravine with a lantern and a fresh sheet of paper. By the flickering light, he re-examined one of the larger patterns. It consisted of concentric circles broken by radial lines, each line intersecting the outer ring at what seemed to be equal angles. He took the time to measure them roughly with a small protractor. The differences between each segment were minimal, too small, he noted, to be the product of untrained carving. In the margin of his new drawing, he wrote, "Angle divisions approx, equal, suggests knowledge of simple geometric partitioning. Echoes some astronomical diagrams." The question mark at the end was rare in his notes. It marked the edge of what he could fit into his existing categories. Astronomy belonged to universities, not canyon walls. The following days brought more puzzles. As the party moved deeper into the valley, they encountered caves whose entrances were marked with the same geometric motifs. Inside, the air felt unnaturally still, and certain chambers produced strange echoes. A whisper near one wall would return not as a simple reflection, but as a layered, delayed murmur that seemed to shift direction. Crawford tested this effect with methodical care, clapping his hands at different points and timing the returns. He noted the irregular acoustics in his journal, attributing them tentatively to unusual rock formations. "For the purposes of this survey," he wrote, "no practical impact on measurements. Phenomenon curious, but irrelevant." The word irrelevant was underlined. He had to choose which observations mattered for the map he was being paid to produce. Back in camp, however, irrelevance proved harder to maintain. The men in the expedition began reporting uneasy sleep and persistent impressions of sound, distant voices, low vibrations, occasional faint singing, without identifiable sources. Crawford, initially skeptical, experienced a similar sensation on the 4th night. Lying awake, he heard what seemed like a slow, rhythmic pulse echoing through the ground, barely audible yet distinct enough to interfere with rest. He got up, checked the camp perimeter, and found nothing. In his notebook, he mentioned the incident in neutral terms. Unusual low-frequency resonance in the night, possibly wind through caverns or distant rockfall. No visible cause. Then, almost as if correcting himself, he added, "No bearing on geological survey. noted only for completeness. The structure of his notes reveals a mind determined to preserve the boundary between data and distraction. Each time an observation threatened to pull him into the realm of narrative, the domain the Ute guides had invoked with their refusal, he labeled it and then pushed it aside. Elevations, distances, and coordinates continued to fill the main columns of his pages. Annotations about acoustics, carvings, or unsettling impressions stayed in smaller script along the edges. Still, the valley was not passive. On the seventh day, while mapping a series of minor ridges along the northern wall, Crawford positioned his theodolite to take a standard set of readings. As he adjusted the instrument, he realized that one of the larger carved patterns on the rock directly opposite lined up almost perfectly with a distant peak when viewed through the sight. Curious, he rotated the instrument slightly and noted that another carved line intersected with the same peak at a different angle. He repeated this exercise at 3 different locations and obtained consistent results. The carvings, when viewed from specific points on the valley floor, appeared to mark sight lines to prominent features on the surrounding mountains. It was as if whoever had made them had been conducting their own survey, using tools and purposes long forgotten. Crawford devoted an entire page to this discovery. He sketched the relative positions of rock, carving, and peak, penciling in rough angles. Beneath the diagrams, he wrote, "Patterns may constitute primitive survey or ritual alignment system, unclear whether symbolic or practical in intent." Then, after a pause, he drew a separating line and resumed his usual format: latitude, longitude, altitude. For a brief moment, his professional and personal curiosity had overlapped. The valley contained not just land to be measured, but evidence of an earlier system of measurement, a different way of making the earth speak. Yet the demands of his assignment pulled him back toward the familiar. His contract with the territorial government did not extend to archaeology, let alone to the deciphering of carved geometries whose meaning no one had requested. It is here, in this quiet tension between obligation and curiosity, that the story of the expedition begins to diverge from what might have been possible. Crawford could have chosen to expand the scope of his report, to treat the valley not merely as a set of elevations, but as a site of prior knowledge. He could have written to the survey's headquarters, urging a more comprehensive investigation. Instead, he began to make a series of small decisions that, taken together, narrowed the record. When he drafted his preliminary summary for the territorial authorities, he described the valley as topographically typical of glacial basins in the range, with some minor cave systems and rock markings of local interest. The phrase "of local interest" served as a quiet dismissal. It signaled that, in his judgment, these features did not merit further official attention. The more detailed notes on carvings, acoustics, and alignments remained in his personal journal, not in the formal report. Around the campfire, Wilkes sensed this narrowing. "You're not going to mention the cave echoes?" he asked one evening, glancing at Crawford's draft. "They fall outside the scope of the survey," Crawford replied. "We are mapping landforms, not writing folklore." "But they're not just stories," Wilkes insisted. "You measured them. You drew the patterns." Crawford closed his notebook with deliberate care. "The government is not paying us to speculate about what people long dead thought they were doing," he said. "They want boundary lines and elevation data." The conversation ended there, but the choice it reflected would shape everything that followed, not only for the expedition, but for anyone who might later try to understand what had really been found in that valley. By the time the party prepared to leave, Crawford had assembled a complete and technically accurate map. Contours were drawn, peaks named or numbered, streams traced to their sources. The valley had been translated into the language of surveyors. Lines, points, and coordinates that could be superimposed on other maps to define claims, routes, and jurisdictions. What remained off the official map were the elements that did not fit easily into that language. The carved geometries, whose precision rivaled his own instruments, the acoustic anomalies that defied simple explanation, the Ute refusal to enter a place they had known by a name that spoke of the earth itself. These omissions were not the result of malice or conspiracy. They grew from a disciplined insistence on separating what counted as data from what could be dismissed as noise. Crawford believed he was doing his job correctly by leaving uncertain elements in the margins. Yet it was precisely in those margins that another kind of story was trying, quietly, to be told. When the expedition finally rode back out over the ridge, the valley lay behind them exactly where it had been before. Its caves remained, its carvings still lined up with distant peaks, its strange echoes untouched. On paper, however, it had become something more manageable, a basin with known coordinates, suitable for inclusion in atlases, land grants, and development plans. The men packed their instruments, folded their tents, and began the long return journey to the territorial capital, unaware that the most consequential part of their work was not what they had measured, but what they had chosen not to measure at all. They did not realize it at first, but the only complete record of what they had truly seen in the valley never reached any official archive. It stayed instead in a single leather-bound notebook that did not follow the rest of the expedition's papers to the survey's headquarters. In the months after their return, Crawford's formal report was filed, catalogued, and quietly forgotten among dozens of other routine surveys. His private journal, however, the one with the sketches of carved geometries and notes about unusual acoustics, was left on a shelf in his study, where no clerk, commissioner, or academic committee would ever read it. That quiet separation between what became official and what remained personal is where the second part of this story begins. In the weeks following the expedition, Crawford worked methodically to turn his field measurements into clean, inked maps. The territorial capital, with its brick offices and dusty streets, felt almost too narrow after the open spaces of the mountains. He spent long hours in a small drafting room, tracing contour lines, double-checking calculations, and labeling features with either U.S. Geological Survey nomenclature or the anglicized versions of local names. The valley they had mapped appeared on his final sheet as Unnamed Basin Number 7, with a parenthetical note, Local designation uncertain, reported Ute term not verified. In the accompanying text, he referred to it simply as the basin. The more evocative translation he had once written in his notebook, place where the earth speaks, did not appear. When the chief surveyor reviewed Crawford's submission, he found nothing unusual. The map adhered to standards. Elevations were consistent with known reference points. The descriptive report was concise and appropriately technical. A brief line about cave systems of limited extent and rock markings of probable indigenous origin satisfied the office's expectation that such features be mentioned, but not dwelt upon. The chief initialed the margins, signed the approval page, and sent the documents into the slow machinery of printing and distribution. County officials, railroad planners, and mining interests would eventually receive copies, if and when they requested them. None of those readers would ever suspect that an entirely different layer of observation existed in parallel, recorded in another hand, under another set of headings. Wilkes, the assistant, understood this better than anyone. He had seen both sets of writings, the official report and the private journal, and could not shake the difference between them. In the official document, the valley was a collection of slopes and drainage patterns. In the journal, it was a place of carved alignments, anomalous echoes, and a persistent sense that something more than geology had shaped its contours. One evening, after the maps had been sent to be engraved, Wilkes visited Crawford at his home. On the desk lay the familiar leather-bound notebook, its edges darkened by field use. Wilkes opened it with the familiarity of someone who had watched it being written, turning directly to the pages with the geometric sketches. "You're really not going to submit any of this?" he asked, tapping the diagram where carved lines met distant peaks. "Not even as an appendix?" Crawford, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm, shook his head. "It would only raise questions we're not prepared to answer," he said. "The survey expects us to provide certainty, contours, coordinates, boundaries, not speculation about the intentions of people whose names we don't even know." "But you measured some of this as carefully as the elevations," Wilkes persisted. "The alignments, the echo patterns, those are observations, not guesses." Crawford did not deny it. "They are observations," he agreed, "but they are not observations that change the map, and the government pays us for maps." That sentence, simple on its surface, carried an entire philosophy. To Crawford, the map was not merely one representation among others. It was the final form into which all relevant information had to fit. Anything that could not be translated into its language of lines and numbers risked being treated as extraneous. Wilkes left that evening with a growing unease he could not clearly define. He was not trained to argue about epistemology, and he respected Crawford's discipline. Yet he sensed that by drawing too sharp a line between what changed the map and what did not, they had created a blind spot large enough to swallow something important. The next indication that this blind spot might have consequences came from an unexpected direction. Several months after the survey, Crawford received a letter from a Jesuit priest stationed in the foothills near the Sangre de Cristo Range. The priest, Father Ashford, had heard rumors of the survey and wrote to inquire whether Crawford's party had visited a particular valley known to the local Utes as a place of dangerous voices. The letter cited fragments of oral tradition, warnings about old paths where the stone remembers, stories of hunters who followed echoes into the cliffs and did not return. Crawford read the letter once, frowned, and placed it beside his journal. The description matched the basin they had mapped, down to the mention of unusual acoustics in certain caves. Ashford was not asking for a scientific explanation. He wanted confirmation that the valley had been entered and perhaps some reassurance about its nature. In his reply, Crawford kept to the same narrow register he had used in his official report. He confirmed that his team had surveyed a basin matching Ashford's description and that they had found nothing of immediate geological or economic significance beyond what was included in the map. He mentioned cave systems with some curious echo effects likely due to irregular rock formations, but he framed these as natural curiosities. On the subject of indigenous stories, he wrote, "Our observations were confined to physical geography. Spiritual or cultural interpretations fall outside the scope of this office." Ashford's response was brief and polite. He thanked Crawford for the information and mentioned that some in the nearby settlement remained uneasy about the valley, but that the knowledge of a government survey seemed to have reassured others. The land, it seemed, had now been both named and measured in the language of authority. Whether or not that language captured all that mattered was not something anyone in the correspondence was prepared to address directly. It was Wilkes who first noticed how quickly the map began to reshape local behavior. A year after the expedition, he happened to pass through a small town not far from the range while on another assignment. In the general store, tacked to a rough wooden wall, he saw a copy of Crawford's map pinned open. A group of men stood around it, discussing potential routes for a new logging operation. One traced a finger along the contours of the unnamed basin. "Look here," the man said. "Good runoff, sheltered from the worst weather, not too steep to cut. And the survey boys say there's nothing special there, just another valley." The others nodded. The map had settled the question more decisively than any story could have. Whatever the Ute guides had refused to approach, whatever geometric patterns lined the rocks, whatever echoes whispered in the caves, all of that was now outweighed by clean lines and elevations on a sheet of government paper. Wilkes did not intervene. He stood for a moment listening, then stepped back outside. The sun was bright, the air thin. For the first time, he felt that what they had left out of the official record was not merely an academic curiosity, but a kind of structural error, a misdescription that would propagate through decisions far beyond their control. He wrote to Crawford about the encounter, choosing his words carefully. "It seems our map has already begun to guide uses of the basin," he noted. "I cannot help but wonder whether, in omitting certain details, we have given too simple an impression of the place." Crawford's reply was measured, almost terse. "Our responsibility is to ensure that what we include is accurate," he wrote. "To add unverified or poorly understood phenomena would be to mislead in another direction. If others choose to make use of the land based on our topographical description, that is their decision. We have not stated that the basin is safe, only that it is shaped as drawn." The distinction comforted Crawford, but it did little to resolve Wilkes's disquiet. The map, whatever its disclaimers, was already functioning as more than a neutral description. It was acting as an invitation. Over the next 2 years, minor references to the basin began to appear in local records. A mining claim was filed and then abandoned. A small logging operation reported equipment difficulties and unusual accidents, though nothing severe enough to reach territorial newspapers. The valley remained mostly untouched, but its status had changed. In official eyes, it was no longer an unknown place with a reputation. It was a surveyed, documented piece of land awaiting human use. During this time, Crawford largely withdrew from field work due to worsening health. He spent more time at his desk reviewing other surveyors' reports. The journal from the 1893 expedition stayed within arm's reach, its pages occasionally revisited, but never integrated into any formal document. One winter, when snow made travel impractical, he used the quiet months to organize his personal papers. He considered briefly the possibility of writing a separate article for a scientific society about the carved geometries in the basin. Such a paper would have to balance description with restraint, acknowledging patterns without overreaching in interpretation. Yet each time he outlined it, he ran into the same obstacle. He could not offer a clear explanation of what the carvings meant, only that they existed and exhibited unexpected precision. Crawford's training inclined him to avoid publication where he could not provide firm conclusions. Gradually, the idea faded. The notebook returned to its shelf beside other volumes filled with observations that never became part of any official record. What neither he nor Wilkes could fully see, enclosed as they were within their professional habits, was that the real significance of the carvings and echoes did not depend on being understood. It depended on being acknowledged as part of the valley's reality, something that, once admitted into the official description, would require others to at least consider the possibility that the basin was more than just a convenient pocket of timber and water. Instead, the structure of the survey's work pushed them in the opposite direction. The need to present precise, unambiguous information led to a filtering process in which anything that resisted easy categorization was treated as secondary. Elevations made the cut, resonances did not. Boundaries went on the map, stories stayed in the margins. The system did not forbid mention of anomalies, but it did not reward it either. By the time Wilkes realized how thoroughly the basin's official identity had been fixed, the choices that created that identity were no longer easy to revisit. Maps had been printed and distributed, claims had been filed. Local authorities spoke of the valley using the survey's terminology. The Ute Guide's refusal to enter it had receded into the status of an obsolete superstition, something old men might mention, but younger settlers rarely heard. There is no single moment in the surviving documents when anyone consciously decides to ignore what did not fit. Instead, there is a series of small, individually reasonable decisions to keep the report within its assigned scope, to avoid speculation, to prioritize what could be measured with confidence. Taken together, they formed a kind of cognitive corridor through which only certain kinds of reality could pass. The carvings still lined up with the peaks. The caves still bent sound in ways that made sleep uneasy. Whatever had once led the Ute Guides to stand at the ridgeline and decline to go farther still existed. But in the world of maps, papers, and official understanding, the basin had become something simpler. The men who had been closest to its complexity, Crawford and Wilkes, were now, in different ways, complicit in its reduction. They had not lied. Every figure in the report was accurate. Every contour on the map matched the land. Their failure lay not in what they recorded, but in what they allowed the record to leave unchallenged. By the end of the decade, when a new set of prospectors approached the valley carrying copies of the survey's charts, no one mentioned the geometric carvings or the strange echoes. The only guidance they carried was a map that said, in effect, "Here is a basin, unremarkable in form, ready to be used." The stage was set. The next decisions, taken by people who had never seen the original notebook and had no reason to suspect that anything was missing, would unfold within the narrowed world that map had created. They carried the map like a permission slip. None of the men who rowed toward the basin a decade after Crawford's survey had ever spoken to a Ute elder or read Nathaniel Crawford's private journal. What they had instead was a folded sheet stamped with the seal of the U.S. Geological Survey, where the valley appeared as clean contour lines and a neat label. Basin, elevation, 9,200 Vefalf. On that piece of paper, there were no warnings, no carved geometries, no mention of echoes. The land was described in the neutral language of opportunity, and so they entered it as if nothing more existed. The party that followed Crawford into the valley was smaller than his survey team, but its purpose was far more ambitious. Led by a timber entrepreneur named Isaac Merrick, it consisted of a dozen loggers, a sawmill engineer, and a cook. Merrick had acquired rights to harvest a section of forest in the upper reaches of the range. The basin, with its sheltered stands of mature pine and reliable water sources, appeared ideal for establishing a semi-permanent logging camp. In the company office back in town, the decision had seemed straightforward. Merrick had unrolled Crawford's map on a long table, weighed down the corners with ink bottles, and traced a thick pencil line along the basin's central stream. "Here," he said to his partners. "Natural road down the canyon, good gradient for moving logs. The government boys already mapped it. Nothing out of the ordinary. We put a camp here, here, and here." One of the partners, a man with some experience in mountain work, had hesitated. "The Utes don't like that basin," he remarked. "You hear stories." Merrick tapped the map. "The Utes don't file reports," he said. "The survey does. This is the latest word. Elevations don't lie." The argument ended there, not because the stories had disappeared, but because the structure of authority had changed. The printed map, with its precise contours and formal seal, outweighed oral warnings in the calculus of risk. Merrick's men would go where the lines suggested it was reasonable. When they reached the valley, they followed a route different from Crawford's, approaching from the south rather than the eastern ravine. The first impression was, again, of ordinary beauty. Tree-covered slopes rising into sharp peaks, clear streams, high meadows touched by wind. The men noted good timber, ample water, and a sheltered floor suitable for building cabins and a small mill. Merrick, standing near the center of the basin, unfolded the map and aligned it with the visible peaks. The lines matched what he saw. He felt reassured. Whatever stories the Utes told, the land in front of him corresponded to the official description. It looked navigable. It looked profitable. They began by marking trees for felling and staking out a site for camp buildings. The sounds of axes and saws, shouts and laughter, soon replaced the quiet that had held the valley between Crawford's departure and their arrival. The intrusion was physical, but not yet reflective. No one paused to ask what kind of silence they were breaking. For the first few weeks, the operation progressed with rough efficiency. Trees came down, were stripped and dragged toward the stream. A small water-powered saw began to take shape. The men worked hard, cursed the cold, and complained about the isolation. But none of these were unusual for frontier labor. At night, they gathered around fires, telling stories of other camps, other winters. Only gradually did they begin to notice that something about this place felt wrong in ways they could not easily name. It started, as it had for the survey team, with sound. One evening, as the men gathered for supper, a logger named Harlan remarked, that he kept hearing what sounded like distant hammering long after work had stopped. "Like someone still on shift up in the rocks," he said, gesturing toward the cliffs. Others agreed. At first, Merrick assumed it was echo from their own activities, but the sounds persisted on days when no felling took place, on still nights when the air carried nothing but the faint rush of the stream. The men tried to dismiss it as nerves or imagination. Logging was dangerous work. Everyone knew that fatigue played tricks on the senses. Yet the pattern repeated often enough that even the most practical among them grew uneasy. They began to avoid certain parts of the basin after dark, especially near the cave entrances that dotted the northern wall. One afternoon, a pair of workers, exploring for better timber, came across the same carved geometries that had caught Crawford's attention. These men had no training in geometry, but they recognized order when they saw it. The patterns, stars of intersecting lines, spirals broken by measured segments, did not look like casual markings. They reported the carvings to Merrick, expecting perhaps some talk of ancient tribes or lost miners. Instead, he frowned and returned with them to inspect the site himself. Standing before the largest panel, he felt an unfamiliar sensation. Not fear exactly, but the uncomfortable awareness of another intelligence expressed in stone. "Probably old Indian signs," he said finally. "Nothing to do with us. Trees don't care who scratched the rocks." His men accepted this answer with varying degrees of conviction. Some made the sign of the cross before turning away. Others spat and joked, trying to lighten the atmosphere. No one suggested that they abandon the basin. The investment was too great, the map too clear. Here, the narrowing begun by Crawford's report exerted its quiet pressure. In another context, the carvings and strange acoustics might have been treated as reasons to reconsider the site, or at least to seek advice from those who still remembered the older stories. But within the framework established by the survey's description, they registered as anomalies without standing. The land had already been declared ordinary. Evidence to the contrary arrived too late to change the basic premise. As weeks passed, mishaps began to accumulate. A cable snapped unexpectedly, while a load of logs was being lowered, killing one man and injuring two others. A storage shed collapsed in calm weather due to what the foreman described as unaccountable warping of support beams. A mule team startled and bolted for no visible reason, crashing a wagon against the rocks near one of the cave mouths. Each incident, taken individually, could be explained. Faulty maintenance, poor construction, animal skittishness. There was no need to invoke anything beyond the usual hazards of rough work. Yet the sequence weighed on morale. At night, the men returned to the topic of the Utes' warnings. Some had heard fragments in town, tales of places where the earth remembers too clearly, where sound could lead a person astray. These stories, dismissed at first as superstition, began to feel less remote when paired with the echoing hammer strokes and the uneasy sleep that plagued the camp. Merrick responded by tightening discipline. He ordered extra inspections of equipment and admonished the men not to invent curses for their own clumsiness. In his private ledger, he recorded the incidents alongside production figures, calculating whether the operation remained profitable. So long as the numbers stayed in the black, he saw no reason to reconsider the location. What he did not see, what none of them saw, was that the structure of their information made certain questions unlikely even to be asked. The only formal reference they possessed, Crawford's map and accompanying report, presented the basin as geologically typical. It did not mention odd acoustics or carved alignments, because those had been deemed irrelevant to the survey's purpose. The men's own experiences, filtered through a culture that valued practicality and distrusted Indian stories, struggled to gain the status of evidence. As a result, each new unsettling event had to fight its way into consciousness against a background assumption of normality. When Merrick wrote to his investors at the end of the first season, his report mirrored this filtering. Camp established successfully in surveyed basin, he noted. Timber quality, as expected. Terrain presents some challenges, rocky outcrops, unstable slopes in places, but nothing beyond our capacity to manage. Workforce somewhat unsettled by local tales of the area, which I consider baseless. Productivity acceptable. Expect increased yield next year with improvements to equipment and routine. No mention of carved symbols. No mention of the way certain shouts seemed to come back twisted. No mention of how several men had requested transfers to other sites, citing bad dreams that made them afraid to sleep near the cliffs. These details stayed in the unofficial realm of camp gossip, just as Crawford's observations had stayed in his private notebook. The pattern repeated across different levels of decision-making. At the territorial office, bureaucrats reviewing Merrick's logging license saw only that the operation was taking place in a surveyed basin with no recorded special status. They approved renewed permits automatically. The few brief accident reports that reached them merged into a general category of occupational hazards. At the mission where Father Ashford served, references to the basin surfaced in confessions and casual conversations. A few wives mentioned husbands who had come back from the logging camp, changed, more withdrawn, listening for sounds no one else heard. A traveling Ute elder, hearing that white men now worked in the valley, shook his head and advised Ashford to counsel them to leave. The priest, trapped between respect for indigenous belief and the authority of government surveys, wrote a worried letter, but did not know where to send it. Crawford, meanwhile, aged quickly. Illness and the weight of years kept him from traveling back to the mountains. Occasionally, he thought of the basin and wondered, with a flicker of unease, whether he had done enough to qualify his original description. But by then, the institutional momentum of his report had carried it far beyond his personal reach. To challenge it would have meant not only revising a map, but admitting that the standards he had followed his entire career might have been incomplete. He never took that step. The notebook stayed on the shelf. The true hinge of the story came on a late autumn day, when Merrick's men, pressured by an approaching winter and a backlog of felled timber, decided to cut a new path closer to the northern cliffs. This route promised to shorten the distance between the stump fields and the stream, saving labor. It also led them near a cluster of cave entrances where the carved geometries were especially dense. Several workers expressed discomfort, but the foreman insisted. "We're just moving logs," he said. "Rocks don't bite." As they worked, the usual noises of logging, shouts, axes, the crack of falling trunks, echoed strangely along the cliff face. At one point, a misjudged cut sent a tree pivoting in the wrong direction, striking a support sled and nearly crushing two men. Later, a loaded cart slipped its braking chain and began to slide toward the caves, its movement accompanied by a rising, almost tonal resonance from within the rock. Accounts of what happened next diverge in minor details, but they agree on one point. The men closest to the cliffs heard something that did not sound like any natural echo they knew. Some described it as a low voice, others as a layered hum that seemed to pass not through the air, but through the ground itself. Whatever it was, it left several of them shaken enough to demand immediate relocation of the work route. Merrick, confronted with these frightened reports, finally agreed to suspend operations along that section of the basin. Not because he accepted the idea of a speaking earth, but because the anxiety was affecting productivity. In his journal he wrote, "Superstitions interfering with efficiency. Will redirect activities to less contentious area. No geological explanation yet, but suspect peculiar cave structure. No action required beyond work adjustment." Once again, the language of management converted lived experience into a minor operational note. The men's encounter with something they could not categorize became, in the record, a question of morale. By now, the basin had accumulated 3 overlapping descriptions, none of them complete. For the Utes, it remained a place of voices, dangerous to enter without proper understanding. For Crawford, it was a geologically typical basin, with some unexplained features not relevant to his remit. For Merrick and his investors, it was a logging site with slightly higher accident rates and an unfortunate tendency to unsettle workers. Each description contained truth. None of them incorporated the others fully. The gaps between them, between story, science, and commerce, were where the valley's deeper reality continued to reside, unacknowledged, yet still exerting influence. The decision that finally locked the outcome was not a single dramatic order, but a quiet choice made in a cramped office, when Merrick, reviewing his accounts after 2 seasons, concluded that despite difficulties, the basin remained profitable enough to justify continued use. He considered briefly selling the rights and relocating the camp. The thought passed when he compared his ledger's columns: timber volume versus wages, equipment costs versus yield. The numbers, though tighter than he liked, still added up. "The valley is difficult," he noted, "but manageable." Manageable. The word encapsulated the central illusion produced by the layers of partial information. Because the map showed nothing extraordinary, because the accidents could be individually rationalized, because no official report used language stronger than curious or unusual, Merrick believed that the risks, whatever their nature, fell within the range of what disciplined management and technical adjustments could control. By the time he signed the papers to extend his operation for another 3-year term, every major actor in the story, surveyors, officials, businessmen, had, in their own way, accepted a narrowed view of the basin. None of them intended harm. Each believed he was acting on sound information. Yet the structure of their beliefs ensured that when reality finally asserted itself in a way none could ignore, they would be profoundly unprepared. That moment lay ahead, not yet written in any of their documents, but already inscribed in the quiet discrepancy between what the valley was and what their records allowed them to see. They only began to take the old stories seriously when it was no longer possible to leave the valley quickly. The winter that finally closed in on Merrick's camp came early and hard, sealing the narrow canyon road with rock slides and snow before the last shipments of timber could be sent down. For the first time since the operation began, the men in the basin had to reckon with the place not as a workplace they passed through, but as an environment they would have to inhabit, day after day, night after night, without escape. By then, the pattern of accidents and unease had already marked the camp. 3 men had died in separate incidents. Several others bore scars from falling logs, snapped chains, and collapsing structures. Each death had its own immediate explanation: a misjudged cut, a worn cable, a rotten beam. Still, the accumulating weight of misfortune had given the basin a reputation even among the most practical workers. New arrivals learned quickly that joking about the voices was acceptable. Speaking of them with any seriousness was not. The early snow altered that balance. Once it became clear that the road would remain blocked for months, a different kind of calculation began to press on the camp. Supplies were adequate, but not abundant. The men's mental reserves, already strained, now had to absorb the knowledge that if anything went badly wrong, if a fire broke out, if disease spread, if injuries overwhelmed their limited medical kit, help would not arrive in time. In this tightened atmosphere, small events took on disproportionate meaning. One night, a minor tremor shook the basin. It was not strong enough to topple structures, only to set dishes rattling and send a fine powder of snow sliding from cabin roofs. The ground shivered once, then settled. The men, startled awake, listened in silence. From the direction of the northern cliffs came a low, rolling sound. At first it seemed like the echo of the tremor itself, but as they listened, it did not decay like an echo should. Instead, it stretched into a drawn-out resonance that shifted in pitch, almost like a sustained note played on some vast, unseen instrument. No one spoke while it lasted. When it finally faded, a logger named Evans exhaled sharply and said too loudly, "Just rock shifting." No one contradicted him. Yet several men later admitted in private that they had felt something in their chests vibrate with the sound, as if the basin itself were briefly alive in a way that had nothing to do with timber or wind. The next morning, Merrick ordered routine inspections of all structures, citing safety, after the tremor. Outwardly, his response was textbook: check beams, reinforce supports, ensure nothing had been loosened. Inwardly, he was aware that his own sleep had been broken, not by the shaking, but by the memory of the Ute elder's warning relayed to him years earlier in town. Some places will answer you if you hit them too long. He did not share that memory with his men. To do so would have been to admit that there might be a category of danger for which his experience and authority had no ready tools. Instead, he tightened routines, more roll calls, stricter rules about venturing near the caves, and reassured himself that discipline would carry them through the winter. It was, in a sense, the last expression of the belief that had guided every major decision so far, that the basin, whatever its peculiarities, remained fundamentally manageable. As weeks passed, the isolation deepened. Snow muffled the basin's usual sounds. Axe blows and saw teeth seemed to carve not only wood, but silence itself. The men found that their voices carried strangely. A shout near the cliffs might return as a whisper behind them, or a word spoken inside one cabin might be faintly audible, distorted, in another. Whether the acoustics had changed or the men's awareness of them had sharpened is difficult to say. Either way, the boundary between natural echo and something less easily named grew thinner. Sleeplessness became common. Several men reported vivid dreams in which they wandered through the caves, following sounds that receded just ahead of them. One woke with blood on his hands, from where he had scraped at the wooden wall beside his bunk, tracing lines that, in the morning light, resembled crude imitations of the carved geometries outside. The camp's physician, a practical man with little patience for superstition, diagnosed nervous strain and recommended more rest. But rest was hard to come by when every creak of the cabins, every distant crack of shifting ice, seemed to blend into a background murmur that no one could quite locate. In this compressed, inward-turned world, Crawford's map, pinned to the wall of the main cabin, took on an almost talismanic quality. Merrick would sometimes stand before it, tracing the clean lines with his finger, as if to reassure himself that the basin was, on paper at least, just another set of contours. One evening, after another minor accident left a worker with a broken leg, the foreman Keene approached the map with unusual intensity. "Look at this," he said to Merrick, jabbing a calloused finger at the empty area near the northern cliffs. "Nothing here but lines. No caves, no carvings, no nothing. If you came in cold with this, you'd never guess what it feels like over there." Merrick answered defensively. "The survey marks elevations, not feelings." "Maybe that's the problem," Keene replied, then immediately wished he had not said it. Questioning the map felt uncomfortably close to questioning the entire chain of decisions that had brought them here. What neither man said aloud was that the map, for all its authority, now seemed incomplete in ways that mattered for survival. It told them where the ground rose and fell, but not where the air thickened with echoes or where dreams grew more vivid. It delineated streams and ridges, but left unmarked the areas where men felt watched or where accidents clustered. The realization came slowly, like water seeping into wood. By the time it was fully formed that they were operating with a description of the basin that no longer captured their lived reality, the options for acting on it were severely limited. Leaving was impossible until spring. Abandoning significant sections of the basin was conceivable, but doing so would severely reduce timber output at a time when their financial margins were already thin. And there was no mechanism, no institutional process, for feeding these new kinds of observations back into the larger system that allocated rights and risk. Even if Merrick wrote to the territorial office to warn that the basin felt wrong, what category would such a warning occupy? There was no line item for acoustics and unease. The structure that had filtered Crawford's observations now trapped Merrick's too. The final incident that forced an end to the operation did not, in itself, differ dramatically from previous accidents. A transport sled loaded with cut logs broke loose on an icy incline near the cliffs and careened into a storage shed, destroying it and injuring 2 workers. What set it apart was not the physical damage, but the reaction of the men. Several who were present later insisted that they had heard a sound. Some said a word, others a kind of drawn-out syllable, shortly before the sled began to move, as if the impact had been preceded by a command. Whether this was a layering of memory over trauma or a genuine auditory phenomenon is impossible to know. What matters is that, for those who heard it, the event confirmed a belief that had been taking shape beneath their conscious reasoning. That the basin itself, or something within it, was participating in their misfortune. In the aftermath, a group of workers approached Merrick with a demand. When the road cleared in spring, the operation must be relocated. Several threatened to leave the moment a path opened. Wages be damned. They spoke not in the cautious language of probability and risk, but with the certainty of men who had moved beyond argument. "We were told this was just another valley," one said, gesturing toward the cliffs. "It isn't." Merrick, worn down by months of managing fear as much as timber, did not argue as forcefully as he might have a year earlier. Financially, the decision to abandon the camp would be costly. Personally, he could no longer completely dismiss the possibility that they were working in a place where their usual measures of risk did not apply. By spring, when the thaw finally loosened the canyon road, the camp was a diminished version of itself. Machinery stood idle, some of it left behind because hauling it out cost more than it was worth. Cabins showed signs of hasty repair and stress. The men were thinner, quieter. When they finally filed out of the basin, few looked back. In town, Merrick filed a final report with territorial authorities, couched in terms the bureaucracy could process. "Logging operation in basin discontinued," he wrote. "Cumulative safety concerns due to unstable slopes, unpredictable acoustics, complicating communication, and worker morale issues. Recommend caution in future development plans for the area. Further geological and perhaps acoustic study might be warranted." It was, for a man of his background, a significant concession. The phrase acoustic study was an oblique way of acknowledging phenomena he did not want to describe more directly. Yet even here, the language of the system softened the reality. Words like unstable slopes and morale issues transformed a lived experience of something fundamentally disquieting into manageable-sounding categories. The authorities received the report, noted the withdrawal, and placed it in a file. With no immediate economic pressure to exploit the basin further, and with other more accessible resources available elsewhere, the question of what the valley really was receded once again into the background. Crawford, now an old man, heard about the camp's closure in a brief mention from a colleague. The news stirred his memory of the carved geometries and the echoes in the caves. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder, not just in passing, whether the omissions in his original report had played a role in what had followed. He took down the leather-bound notebook and reread the pages from 1893. The drawings were as clean as ever. Precise lines, careful measurements, marginal notes about unusual resonance, and possible alignment system. In the privacy of his study, he admitted to himself that the valley had presented him with evidence that did not fit his categories, and that he had chosen quietly to leave its implications unexplored. Crawford considered writing an addendum, a late supplement to the official record in which he would describe as plainly as he could what he had observed. But as he drafted the first paragraphs, he confronted an uncomfortable truth. Even now, he could not say with confidence what the carvings and echoes meant. He could describe them, but not interpret them. And he feared that a document offering only descriptions without clear conclusions would be dismissed as the ramblings of an aging surveyor. In the end, he did what he had always done when faced with information that resisted neat assimilation. He closed the notebook and returned it to the shelf. The basin remained, in official maps and records, a topographical feature with a history of one failed logging operation. For the Utes, it remained what it had always been, a place to be approached with caution, if at all. For the men who had worked there, it became a story told in low voices, often at night, often with more laughter than the content really merited. What we are left with, looking back, is not a tale of sudden catastrophe or spectacular revelation. It is the account of how an initially reasonable set of assumptions about what counts as data, about what maps need to include, about which voices matter, can create a structure in which certain realities are systematically excluded. Crawford was not wrong to trust his instruments. Merrick was not irrational to rely on an official survey. The territorial authorities were not malicious in prioritizing clear, quantifiable information. Each decision, at the moment it was made, seemed justified. Yet from the vantage point of distance, a pattern emerges. Key evidence about the basin, the lived warnings of the Ute guides, the carved geometries, the acoustic anomalies, the accumulating unease of those who stayed there too long, never achieved full status as real in the systems that governed land use and risk. It was seen, heard, and even measured, but it was not allowed to reshape the frameworks within which decisions were made. In that sense, the basin did not defeat anyone through a single dramatic event. It simply waited while human institutions arranged their own misunderstandings around it. The map was accurate within its chosen limits. The reports were honest as far as they went. The failure lay in the certainty with which those limits were accepted as sufficient. Once that certainty hardened into routine, once everyone involved agreed, without needing to say it, that some things belonged in the record and others did not, the outcome became less a matter of chance and more a matter of time. No secret weapon, no hidden technology, no deliberate deception was required. A valley, a survey, a logging camp, a series of reasonable decisions. Between them, a gap where inconvenient knowledge slipped away. Years later, when new editions of regional maps were printed, the basin still appeared in clean contour lines, unchanged. The paper version endured. The notebook with the sketches remained on a forgotten shelf. The stories of those who had heard something in the stone drifted into local folklore. Information had existed in the carvings, in the echoes, in the memories of guides and workers. What determined its fate was not its presence, but the beliefs people brought to it. Beliefs about what mattered, what counted, and what could be safely ignored. In the end, the most consequential force at work in that isolated valley was not geological or supernatural. It was human certainty, moving quietly through forms and maps, narrowing the world until only what fit on paper seemed real.